Say when, Tim.
You're on.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. We have a great program tonight from Nico Carver. But before we introduce Nico, we want to say just a few things about some of the upcoming shows and some of the programs that we have going. Alex, you want to tell us about who's coming up the next couple of weeks?
Sure. I'm still playing hooky, so I'm not at home, so I don't have my calendar to bring up, but I understand that Tim's going to bring it up for you. And you'll note that next week, Ron Brecher is going to be here. Ron Brecher is a PixInsight ambassador, which means that he knows a whole lot of stuff about PixInsight, and he's a good teacher. I know the guy, and he's pretty good. Rod Pommier is coming up the week after that. Ron is going to talk about removing stars, so simplifying your processing. And then Rod's going to come up the next week after that to tell us about how he used amateur astronomy rigs and basic mathematics to help calculate the distance to M31. And we thought that'd be a kind of a kick to see how he did all that stuff. We've got lots of other shows planned for you all the way through and past AIC and NEAP, and I hope that you are all getting your reservations in for those two big events for Astro Imagers. And then I'm going to turn it back to Eric, who is the host for tonight.
Thanks, Alex. And Rory, you want to tell us where we are with TIA shots?
Yeah, so we're still accepting processed images of the Tarantula Nebula by Terry. You can submit that by March 13th, and then we're going to do a presentation on the 27th of March. So far, I got three volunteers to present: Jason Dane, John Richards, and Brandon Nance. So thank you guys. Looking for a couple more. So head on over to the astroimagingchannel.org, and you can submit under the TAC workshop there until March 13th. Thank you, guys.
Hey, if you haven't downloaded that data set, I would certainly recommend it. Even if you don't want to make a presentation, it is the most complete data set. Well, we can cut that out later. Data set for that. Don't hold your brow, Alex. I'm sorry, I'm getting scolded. It's the most complete data set for that target that I have ever seen, and I did it just for fun. And if you haven't downloaded, please go ahead and do it. We have another program coming up. Arno, you want to give us an update?
Yes, so for the tech shots, we are gathering images of the solar system. So we still have some room for some more images, so please submit them before the 3rd of April. We have that show on the 24th of April. But, I haven't seen any nice images of Saturn or any of the other close-up of the planet. So go ahead and start submitting. Again, they're on the website under Tech Shots. Back to you, Eric.
Listen, it doesn't have to be a planet. It can be one of the big asteroids that are, going through your image if you have a track of an asteroid. If you have one of the comets, I know we did a comet show, but if you have another comet that we didn't do a show on, submit that. They're all part of our solar system.
Yeah.
And thanks, Arno. So tonight we have Nico Carver, who's going to give a presentation, but I have watched Nico's images on Astrobin, and I am truly jealous of some of his wide. In fact, I'm jealous of all of his wide field images. And he's going to tell us a little bit more about that. Professionally, Nico works at an astronomy library at Harvard, which is kind of an interesting thing. And he says he has the largest collection of astronomy books at his fingertips, larger than anybody else, I assume. Nico, if you want to take over, it's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'll start my presentation here. Okay, can you see that? Looks like it's good. Okay, so I'm a longtime watcher of the Astro Imaging channel, so it's an honor to be on tonight. And one thing I really like about the show is how you always have such an interesting and wide breadth of presentations that really cover so many different aspects of our hobby. So I hope to, add to that mix by talking about something that I really enjoyed doing, which is capturing nebulae without a telescope, so just with camera lenses. And I do this with various techniques and gear, so hopefully there's going to be a little bit of something for everyone in tonight's presentation. Here's a quick overview. I always start presentations like this with a little bit about myself and how I got into astrophotography, because I always find that interesting in other people's presentations when they share a little bit about how they got into astrophotography. So my journey into astrophotography started in December 2014. I was on vacation in Iceland, and I went to Iceland specifically to see the aurora borealis. I had previously, in 2008, been working over the summer in Alaska, and towards the end of that summer, in early September, it finally got dark enough so that we could look for the aurora, and I did see it in 2008. But it was a little bit underwhelming because it wasn't fully dark yet, so I didn't see any color, but I could definitely see some movement. But that got me sort of thinking, I really want to see them again. And so I planned the whole vacation around seeing the Northern Lights and rented a four-wheel drive vehicle and braved those icy roads. And even with planning, I've heard from many other people now that they go to Iceland to see the aurora and get clouded out. And as astrophotographers, we all know that can happen. But luckily for me, I had 2 clear nights that were also active in terms of aurora. And this was the second night, I think. And I didn't know this at the time, but 2014 was actually a really good time to go because it was solar maximum, when the sun is most active and we get the most auroral activity, usually around solar maximum. And so this was my first really jaw-dropping experience with the aurora, where I was driving around looking for it. I could sort of see it out the side of my window, but then as soon as I got out of the car and looked up, I saw that it covered the entire sky, like horizon to horizon. So I wish now, this was my widest lens at the time. It was 14 millimeters. And I wish I had brought a circular fisheye, because it would have just been so cool to see, to show how the aurora can fill the whole sky when you're at a northern enough latitude. And at the time, what I was really into in terms of my photography was time-lapse photography. So that's where you take, a shot after shot for, let's say, half an hour or an hour with no break. And then you sequence all of those photos together to make a short video like this. So this is probably, I think, 30 minutes of time, but then when you sequence it at 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second, it goes by very much quicker. So it does give you an idea of the motion of the aurora, but of course it's really sped up. And here's another one. This was the next experience with it. This was the 5th night of the trip. And this is actually a pretty famous spot for aurora chasers, I think, because there are a lot of photographers here. I don't know if you can see that on the right there, but there's a bunch setting up all around. This is called a glacier lagoon. And so now, at the time, I didn't know anything about astrophotography. I don't think I even knew the word, but now I think of this as my first star party, because there were so many experienced photographers there willing to share, tips and their experiences with chasing the aurora. And it wasn't until I got home and spent a little, so I was just so focused on time-lapse photography that it wasn't until later that I took out a single frame out of my time-lapse and tried to edit it like this. And I was really amazed at how many colors came out when I just brightened the picture. And so, because with time-lapse, I didn't really do anything to those photos. I just sequenced them and just straight out of camera. So just editing it a little bit with like an S-curve, I was just like, wow, there's so much in there, so much in the data. So that was sort of my really first experience with astrophotography processing per se. And it was, now I look at this shot and I'm thinking, wow, this was a really lucky shot considering I had no idea what I was doing. But I guess it shows you that if you have the right location, the right conditions, you can get really beautiful things even with just a single exposure. And I found out later that that red glow along the horizon in the back is not actually part of the aurora. That's actually the glow from an active volcano, because we're looking into the island here. And so it was also interesting to me to see all the different aspects of this, the reflection and the stars and the aurora. So this is probably the first photo where I got pretty hooked. And then over the next year or so, I started dabbling into other wide angle captures of the night sky. And so this one was, I was on a trip to Las Vegas for work for a conference and decided I just extend that trip a couple nights to visit Death Valley National Park, which I'd never been to. And so in the foreground here, you can see these are called the sailing stones, and they're on part of the park called the playa. And they're a really cool feature if you ever go to Death Valley. It's sort of hard to get out to the playa because it's a pretty long drive away from any kind of gas station or civilization, but I think it is worth it to see it. And they didn't know until 2014, so 1 year before I was there, what this phenomenon was about, that why these stones seem to move across the playa and create these tracks. And then in 2014, they did time-lapse photography of the playa and figured out that at certain times when conditions are just right, a thin layer of ice forms on the playa and the stones can move, sort of skate across that ice because the wind pushes them before the ice, evaporates and with the sun coming up and everything. So I thought that was a really cool feature. And what I tried to do with this shot was sort of lead the eye with those tracks into the Milky Way. Now, I still didn't know that much about astrophotography. I had just been sort of doing what most people do, which is go on Google and see what you can find. So looking at this shot now, I think that it's not perfectly in focus. The sky isn't, and it could be a little bit improved, but it was still another sort of positive, step in the direction of being hooked, because I was like, okay, this is pretty neat too. But my issue was, at this time, I thought, okay, you need to find really dark skies to do this at all. I'm living in a city. How am I going to pursue astrophotography on a more sort of regular basis? And so that's when I started really researching deep sky astrophotography. And because I'm a librarian professionally, I research very in depth. And so I think I was researching astrophotography for several months before I bought anything. And at the time, there weren't as many star trackers as available. I knew that I wanted to use the gear that I had, which is like a DSLR and lens. And so I wanted a star tracker, and there weren't too many available that had good reviews, but this one seemed to have pretty good reviews. It was called the Astrotrack system. It's not very popular anymore. The big downside to it is that every 40 minutes or so, it reaches the end of this threaded rod and you have to rewind it. And then when you rewind it, you lose your framing. And so that's a little bit annoying. And so I don't use it as much anymore, but it did work really well, actually. So I miss it in some ways because it's a sort of unique device. But this is what definitely got me hooked, is as soon as I saw that you could capture nebulae with your DSLR and that you could do it from the city. Like this was a Bortle 8 city sky that, the bright nebulae come across even with light pollution. Then I got really hooked, and as I say, I went right down the rabbit hole of gear acquisition, buying more and more stuff, and really going in depth with it pretty quickly. Within, I think, 1 year, I had all of this other stuff, dedicated cameras and filters and telescopes and all of that. And I have to give credit somewhat for my obsession to the Delaware Astronomical Society. That's where I was living in Delaware at the time. And this Delaware group had a very active astrophotography special interest group led by Bill Hannigan. And having that monthly meeting to go to share images and get new tips and just see how enthused everyone else was with astrophotography, I found that really motivating. And I mean, if you don't have a local astronomy club, I think the Astro Imaging channel can can sort of fill that itch as well, to just have something where we come back regularly with other people and share what we're doing. Another thing I did after just about a year after getting that telescope was started a YouTube channel. And this sort of grew out of having an interest in video production. And I was actually, at the time, even though I was a librarian, my day job, I was teaching undergrads about video production and cameras and microphones and the software that goes into that, like Photoshop and things like that, every day. So it was sort of a natural outcropping for me to do a YouTube channel with videos about astrophotography. And that's been a really different kind of creative outlet for the hobby. Sometimes I'm more focused on just getting my own photos, and sometimes I'm more focused on sharing things through YouTube. So it's fun to have that balance, to have both sort of the education side and the just personal projects. All right, so I'm a bit of a gearhead. I like trying out gear, reviewing gear, putting different kits together. So I thought I would just share a few different kits that all just share this commonality of not using a telescope, but you can do different things with each kit, right? So the first kind of kit that I find interesting that a lot of people skip right over after they might think that this kit is only good for Milky Way, but it can actually do other things too, is just a simple kit of a DSLR or a modified DSLR, a camera lens, and a tripod. And so this is just an example of gear that might work. And I think when we get to photos, I'll share a photo that I did with this specific collection of gear. But this is a really inexpensive way to get started capturing nebulae. It helps for the camera to be modified, because then all of the red nebulae, all the ones that have the H alpha emission, are going to come out through a lot stronger when you've opened up that side of the spectrum to that light. A stock DSLR usually passes the HA emission line at something like 25–30%. And then, of course, if you open it up, it opens it up to 100%, right? I have played around with different modifications. I do like the full spectrum because it's a little bit more flexible. You can use it also as an infrared camera, which is cool in the daytime to get different kinds of images. But you can also just get a simpler HA modification and then not have to use a clip-in filter. So we could probably just do away with that extra clip-in filter, depending on the modification you get. I called this kit Nico's Choice because I've been thinking about, if I had to get rid of all my astrophotography gear, which right now takes up like a whole room in my apartment, what would I keep? And I actually think that I would keep something simpler like this, and not the full-on big mount with dedicated camera and narrowband filters and all of that. Because right now, at least in my progress, I'm really enjoying something like this that you can pack down into a carry-on bag and bring with you on a vacation and just have fun with it. And so this is a dedicated astro camera in a way, but it's a mirrorless camera. So you don't need to use a computer with something like a Canon EOS RA. The thing I do like about the mirrorless cameras over DSLRs, which I didn't really know until I got one, was that their screen is very bright. So it makes framing and focusing so much easier than with a DSLR. It's not something that I feel like a lot of people are talking about yet, because a lot of people probably haven't moved to the mirrorless cameras, but it was something I was shocked by when I first got that out under the night sky, was just how bright the LCD screen was on the night sky. I could see things like the Flame Nebula on live view. And so I was blown away by that. And it makes focusing really easy too, because you can actually really see those really dim stars. And when you can see those dim stars, you'll find that with a lens, when you're focusing, there's just a position where they all of a sudden disappear, and then you just move the focus just a little bit, and all those dim stars pop in to the live view. And so it makes focusing a lot easier, even if you don't have the right kind of Batonov mask or something like that. I'll talk about this lens probably when we get to photos, but in terms of the Canon RF lenses, this has been my favorite that I've tested. It's the 85 millimeter f1.2. I might like a star tracker that could do go-to, but I also sort of like the challenge of having to frame without the go-to. And let's see if I have anything else to say about this gear. Sort of standard stuff. The only other thing I'd say about it is it really does help when you're framing things to be able to rotate. And so this is one drawback I find of camera lenses, and is that it's often harder to rotate because they don't have manual rotators built in like many telescopes. So you usually have to find some kind of ring, like a lens ring, or use or adapt something. So in this case, I found that Prima Luce Labs make a ring that perfectly fits the Canon RF 85 millimeter lens. In other cases, I found you can still use those split rings, but might have to have an insert to make it fit securely. So I could talk about that if anyone has any questions about it, but that's a really nice thing to have is some kind of way to rotate the camera for ideal framing. Okay, I called this one serious business. This is what I would use if I wanted to shoot from my Bortle 8 Sky here in Somerville. Because the light pollution is so bad, it's hard to do broadband imaging. So I'll usually use something like this, where you're basically you have almost a telescope-like setup, but if you want to go really wide, you use a camera lens in place of the telescope. And this setup can be fully automated, meaning you can even get autofocus going. There's a outfit called Astromechanics that makes a controller for EF lenses. And so that's been really nice in that I can actually have an ASCOM autofocus thing for my EF lenses and my dedicated camera. So you could take this rig and fully set it up for automated imaging and just leave it alone. I don't often do that because I really like being out under the stars, but if that was important to you, you can do that with camera lenses today, at least with the Canon EF lenses. And then of course, people do it other ways too. You don't need necessarily the ASCOM controller that can control the internal focus motors. You can also use a belt. So there's all kinds of belt and pulley systems for doing autofocus as well. I've had mixed results with those. Sometimes the thing I don't like about them is if you want to switch back to manual control of your lens, it's sort of a chore. But if you have something that is really stable and you can just set it up and forget about it, then a belt and pulley system works well too. All right. One thing I think a lot of people might think is that if you're going to shoot wide field, that really limits you in terms of target selection or something like that, because there's only so many patches of the sky that are interesting. That's true to some degree. There's certainly some patches of the sky like Orion that we're seeing here that are more full of dust and nebulae that make them more interesting. But I've found that with a little bit of imagination, you can do all kinds of things with wide field that may have not been done before, or may have only been done a few times, or that you don't know until you really start looking into it just how much is out there. So this image is one I like to start with because it shows that you can capture nebulae at basically any focal length. This is the widest kind of focal length you can imagine. It's a circular fisheye lens, meaning you're capturing a 180-degree dome of the sky. And I've seen these kinds of shots before, and usually they're done in a more sort of naturalistic style with the Milky Way. And so I thought it'd be cool to do it with a filter, a dual narrowband filter, so that you really see the red nebulae pop out in the winter Milky Way here. And so you can see it stretches from the Orion constellation at the top of the picture down to Cygnus, which is sort of the setting of the summer Milky Way at the bottom of the picture. And it was in this picture that I first saw this interesting structure right down here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you see the California Nebula there and then the Pleiades right there, right below that, I saw this long line of H-alpha emission, and I had never seen that imaged or knew what it was. So I started looking it up and found out that it's called the Eridanus or Eridanus loop. And it's part of a super bubble with the Barnard's loop over here in Orion. So they're sort of connected, but I hadn't seen any images of it. Of course, then when I did a search for that structure, I found people had imaged it, of course, but it wasn't until I saw this photo that I even knew there was a giant structure right down there below the Pleiades. Another thing I find is that by changing rotation, changing framing and things like that, you can make things feel new. So even if you've shot the Milky Way, dozens and dozens of times, just changing how you present it can really add novelty to your picture, right? So in this case, I thought it would be interesting to put the central core part of the Milky Way straight across rather than at a diagonal or vertical like we usually see it. And that opens up sort of new opportunities to see things. Like I didn't know until pretty recently that this dark nebula structure right here was called the dark horse. And then as soon as you see it, you can't unsee it because it looks so much like a horse in profile. And oh, I should say this photo was done with that setup I called the keeping it simple setup. So this is just done without a tracker. So I'm just putting the camera on a tripod, which is common with Milky Way shooters, but less common with deep sky astrophotographers. And the thing I'll say about untracked is the downside to it, of course, is you're taking many sub-exposures. So there's sort of two worries there. One is that you'll wear out your camera sensor faster. And the other worry is that it uses so much hard drive space and computer processing that it might be impractical for some. I've found that the cost of external hard drives and things like that has gone down so much that I'm not really that worried about the hard drive space. Also, once you put all of those pictures onto the computer and stack them, you can probably just get rid of all of the sub-exposures and just keep the final stack. So I often do that. I don't necessarily keep everything, all my data. I just keep the final stack to work on. The issue of the camera shutter running out or getting worn down quicker is an issue, but I found that usually they're rated for something like 200,000 clicks, something like that. So if I'm shooting occasionally 500 or 1,000 pictures on my camera, I'm not that worried about it because I was doing this kind of thing with time-lapse photography before anyways. My theory is sort of cameras are meant to be used, so I'm not too worried about wear and tear.
Nico, couple questions rolling in here. On the previous camera, you used the RA. Brandon Nance wanted to know, do you use crop mode on the RA when using the 85 millimeter or full frame only?
I've only ever done full frame.
Okay, and then Tim wanted to know, he assumes that the Star Adventure is unable to dither. Do you find walking noise to be an issue?
Yes, yeah, I have seen walking noise be an issue. There's sort of I have two things to say about that. One is that ideally what I do is I image over many nights. So I found that if you image the same thing over, let's say, 5 or 6 nights, and then each night you're going to get a slightly different framing because it's not go-to, so you're not going to get it pixel perfect. If you do that and you get lots of data like that and take very good darks and all of that, walking noise does get diminished a lot. I find that if it's a single night where I have that drift over one night, then the walking noise is pretty strong. I do have some techniques for trying to deal with it in processing, but of course they're not perfect. I found that you really want to avoid smoothing walking noise. So you don't want to use sort of your typical noise reduction methods of applying a blur to it. because I find that that makes it just look even messier and soupier. So what I do is I try to just desaturate it. If you can find out the pixels that are, they're usually hot pixels, so they're usually a sort of red, green, or blue. And if you can find those, select them in something like Photoshop, make sure that it's not selecting the things you don't want it to select, like the nebulae. You can sort of desaturate the walking noise and make it disappear a little bit.
And then what are your thoughts on silent shutter mode? I'm assuming this is for the RA.
Yeah, I've heard that if it's just using I think it's called the electronic curtain, it can save some, because you're not using the mechanical shutter. But then I've also heard that can sometimes cause problems with maybe calibration. So I honestly haven't done like rigorous experiments to find out if there's any issues with silent shutter mode. So I don't know yet, but that is something I should add to my list to figure out, because it would be nice on these mirrorless cameras if just using an electronic curtain saves the mechanical shutter a bit.
Cool, thanks, Nico. That's all the questions for now.
Cool, thanks. So, so with these photos, I also just want to give you some ideas for great wide field targets. So of course, the Milky Way core in Sagittarius is one of them. If we go right down from where this photo is right here, we're in the Ophiuchus Scorpio region. This image is not mine, but Olga, who I know from Instagram and things like that, she's a great Brazilian astrophotographer. She gave me permission to share this image in this presentation. This was done with one of my favorite lenses, the Canon 200 millimeter f2.8. And this is a 9-panel mosaic of this region at 200 millimeters. And it's just one of my favorite images I've seen of this region, with the Rho Ophiuchus cloud complex. I think this is Sharpless 1, if I'm not mistaken, and the Blue Horsehead Nebula up here. So just off the Milky Way, of course, I'm sure almost everyone in the audience knows this region, but I just wanted to highlight it as one of the best sort of wide field targets out there, especially from a dark sky like Olga has. Another thing you can do with just a camera lens that I think is a little bit more difficult to do with a telescope is framing up whole constellations. And so this is at 40 millimeters, and I used a diffusion filter. What a diffusion filter is it takes what are the highlights in your picture, which are the stars, and it spreads them out a little bit. And so it really bloats out the star halos, and you get very colorful, sort of blown out star halos, which I think looks pretty interesting. I think I got the idea for doing this from who's considered the master of constellation photography, Kira Fuji. And if you can find his work on David Mallon's website, he's shot, I think, all of the constellations in the entire night sky. And he really has this nice, I think he shot on 35 millimeter film, but the constellations just really pop out in his images. So I was trying to replicate that a bit here. And this is a really dynamic constellation. It's definitely one of my favorite. It's Cygnus, of course. This was done untracked, so meaning I didn't use a star tracker. I took 4,096 images at 2 seconds each over several nights, maybe 5 nights. And the nice thing about shooting untracked is I usually have telescopes going, I have other mounts going, doing different things, but then you just sort of have some free time, especially if you have your other rigs automated. So I just find untracked astrophotography really relaxing. I just point it wherever I want to go and start snapping away, and maybe just collect images over the whole summer or over a few weeks and stack them all together and see what comes out. So I do like this image. I did really think a lot about the framing of it at 85 millimeters and capturing this large dark nebula up here in the corner. I think they sometimes, I can't remember which one is called the Northern Coal Sack, if it's this one or this one. But I liked how you can really see that this huge dark nebula has these trails that connect to this other huge dark nebula void here in the middle. And then I called it cocoon to Satyr because I often see wide field shots of Cygnus, but I rarely see them include the tiny little cocoon nebula down here in the left corner. And I think that does provide an interesting framing device to put. Another thing I try to do with wide field images, and I'll talk about this when we get to planning, is always have something interesting for the eye to go to in the corners. So then if you're down here in a corner, your eye can sort of be led up into other parts of the image. Oh, and then the other thing that I like to do is use the bright stars as sort of guideposts for looking around the image. So in this one, I also wanted to put Deneb right here, right in the center of the image, as sort of this strong focal point in the middle. This one I shot very recently using the same technique, same gear. So this is the Canon RA, again with the Canon 85mm lens. And of course, it's the constellation of Orion that is very commonly shot. I just sort of wanted to see, well, what can you do without a tracker? And I was really pleased with this one to see that you could bring out things like the Witch Head Nebula here and some of the interesting dust between Barnard's Loop and Orion, and the M78 Reflection Nebula came out pretty well. I was surprised to even see the Boogeyman Nebula and some of this dark nebula dust around Betelgeuse also came out. And this is my most recent video on YouTube if you're interested. But what I was trying to do with this image and the video was show how stacking and signal to noise ratio works. And not just sort of describing it theoretically, but showing examples of, okay, if you just take a 2-second shot, it looks like this. If you take over 1,000 shots, your total integration is now 34 minutes. And what I was doing in the video was sort of quadrupling the total integration each time to show each time you're by quadrupling the total integration, you're doubling the signal to noise ratio, and you can push the image this much further with stretching before you really hit that limit where the noise overtakes the photo. And so I found that at 30 seconds, you had to keep the image sort of dark to avoid the noise just really overwhelming. But by the time you get to 2 minutes, you can push it a little bit further. And then, of course, by 34 minutes, it's really actually starting to look pretty good. And this is true all over the photo. You can see here with very dim details like the Witch Head Nebula, they may be completely invisible in a single exposure. So at 2 seconds, it's completely invisible. Even after stacking 4 images, it's still invisible. At 16 images, if you have a really sharp eye, you might be able to see sort of the outline of it there. And then in these two, you can definitely see it, but it's still really noisy. So if you really try to push the data and bring out those dim details, you might be able to, but it's just going to have a very noisy effect until you get to enough integration that the signal is overwhelming that noise. And so I think a constellation like Orion is a really nice one to show this effect, because you can see that bright areas like the core of Orion pretty much look the same, even from 2 seconds all the way up to 34 minutes. They haven't really changed that much. But the dim areas really come alive the more you push the total integration. Another thing I really enjoy doing is narrowband work with camera lenses. I found that there's actually a lot of interesting compositions for doing narrowband at 85 to 200 millimeters. Nowadays, you can actually get something like a William Optics RedCat at 250 or the Ascar Astro camera lens at 200. But when I started, there wasn't really any telescopes below 300 millimeter focal length. So you really had to use camera lenses. Things are changing a little bit today, but I still find camera lenses really useful because I often do narrowband work at f2.8 or f3 or f3.2. And so to shoot that fast means I can just get pretty reasonable data a lot quicker. So this one is a 2-panel mosaic of the Heart and Soul and then this interesting Sharpless 202 that I think provides a nice counterpoint for this composition. You often see just the heart and soul framed up together, but I think having this weird dim cloud over here on the left makes it even more interesting. This was an early one, the first one that I did where I was really surprised by what I could do, I guess, as an astrophotographer, because I thought it was going to be really challenging. It was, but then when it all came together, I was really blown away by how good it looked. I did this on the road trip to see the total solar eclipse. And this is again with my Canon 200mm lens and a ZWO camera and the H alpha and O3 filters. This is one of my favorite supernova remnants, the Spaghetti Nebula. And unless you want to do a mosaic, it's one that you really need something like a camera lens to capture all in one go. Maybe today with the larger cameras, like the full frame mono cameras, you could do it with a telescope, I suppose. But I feel like back when I keep saying back when I was doing this, but it's only a few years ago. But things are really advancing quickly. When I got this ASI 1600. I think that was what everyone was getting. And now, of course, people have the APS-C and full frame mono CMOS sensors too. The total integration on this one, as you can see, was 18 hours, 40 minutes. This is a fairly dim supernova remnant. I do want to point out that with the brighter supernova remnants, you maybe don't need nearly that much total integration. So I did this one more recently, again, from a Bortle night sky, and it's only 6 hours integration. But I think it looks about as finished as this one at 18 hours. So things really change dramatically in terms of how much time you need on an object, depending on how dim they are. That's something I think we all find out as we progress in this hobby. Lately, I've been getting really into dusty regions, and this is another area where I think that having some camera lenses in your bag can really help, because of course you can shoot dusty objects with a telescope and get a little region of them, but when you pop on something like an 85 or a 105 here onto a full frame camera, it's just amazing how much more can come out. The other really nice thing with camera lenses and dust is very dim. Like, it's just one of the dimmest things out there. It's barely perceptible above the brightness of the night sky. And so shooting at something like f1.4 as I did here, or f1.2 as I can with that Canon lens, really helps get a presentable image very fast. So this is only 48 images at 30 seconds each. And the reason the bottom half of the image looks a little strange is there was some thin high altitude clouds passing by. And I think that this is the technique that Akira Fuji used often with his constellation shots to make the stars bloat a little bit. And I think it's a pretty interesting technique. Another way you can do it is, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is matching or combining rather diffusion filters with no filter. So you can use the diffusion filter to get some of this star halo action, and then use no filter to get the better details in the rest of the picture. Here's another one. This is in Cepheus. And this guy right here, the Dark Shark Nebula, is often shot on its own. But it's interesting to see how all the dust structures interact with each other. This was shot with a really common lens for astrophotographers. It's just well used. A lot of people are using it, the Rokinon or Samyang 135 f2. The reason it's so popular is it's a manual lens. It's pretty affordable for a fast, good telephoto lens. It's, I think, usually $500 or around there. It's available for all the camera systems: Sony, Fuji, Nikon, Canon. So that's one of the most popular lenses for this kind of work. And I've used it a fair amount now, and I really like it too. Here's another one done with that lens. This is the Mandel Wilson 1, or also called the Polaris flare, I believe, and it's the IFN cloud around Polaris. It's another one that I think it really helps to have one of these telephoto lenses to capture it well. This is at 135, and I feel like I could have even gone out to 85 millimeters to capture more of it. This is one, I should say, because someone brought up walking noise, where I really did battle with walking noise. The more you want to stretch really, really dim details, the more walking noise could be an issue. So another thing I want to look into with the Star Adventurer is manual dithering. So just every so often, maybe so how many did I do here? 333 shots. Maybe if I had manually dithered every 20 shots or something, that would have helped with walking noise. This one is one of my recent favorites. And when I talked about that fisheye shot and I mentioned that below the Pleiades, I saw that streak of red and I wondered what that is. And then I looked it up and found out it's this Eridanus loop. I immediately knew I wanted to shoot it. So I started planning. I started thinking, how am I going to do this? And I got the perfect opportunity by going to the Okie-Tex Star Party, which is a very dark sky, portal 1-2-ish. And I shot it over 3 nights, so 5 hours total. It was a little bit early in the season for Orion, but it worked out. And I think that it's one that I'm going to definitely want to return to and maybe do a mosaic project on it, because you can see the framing is a little bit tight. I think it works, but it's a little bit tight for me. I don't like how this yellow star here is so close to the edge, and then also this feature is also very close to the edge, and this one. So I wish I could expand the framing just a little bit on the right side and the top. I do like how it looks down here in the lower left-hand corner with this nice dust interacting with the H-alpha strands. Okay, so that gives you an idea of some of the targets that are popular for wide field imaging. So you can do narrowband, you can do dust, you can do constellations, you can do certain constellations are better than others for nebulae, of course. Orion and Cygnus come to mind, but Cepheus is also really good. I forgot to include my Cepheus shot, but that's another thing I've been working on, is like a really cool grand mosaic of Cepheus, because there's a lot of nebulae in there as well. I'll talk a little bit about planning for wide field. I think a lot of people might overlook planning for wide field, but it's actually a very creative part of the process, because you might have gotten the idea as I've been talking that I pay a lot of attention to framing and where things are in the frame. And with a telescope, a lot of shots, the framing is just going to be centered, right? Like if you're shooting a planetary nebula or a galaxy, it's usually just center framing. But when you do wide field, you can really get creative with rotation and how you put the bright stars and the nebulae in the shot. So there's 2 tools that I use the most often for this work. So I'll just briefly mention them here. One is on the Galaxy Map website. There's the Milky Way Explorer, which has a lot of surveys and interesting tools built into it. And I like this one for just quickly getting a grand idea of where the large structures are, either dust or H-alpha. For more sort of particular framing and seeing how my gear is going to overlay on top of the sky, I go to Blackwater Skies. I also find that there's other tools for this that work just as well, telescopius.com, and there's an app on my phone. Sky Safari also has tools for this. But Blackwater Skies is the one that I started with, Blackwater Skies Imaging Toolbox, so I just keep returning to it. It has lots of tools built into it, like you're seeing the Mosaic Planner tool here. And it also has all of the surveys available through the Aladdin service. So you can pull up something like an H-alpha survey, and you can see the Eridanus loop right there, right next to Barnard's loop. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about my experience with filters and wide field. I have found that very narrowband filters and wide field lenses usually don't play too well together. I'm sure a lot of you already might know this, but when I just was like gung-ho about trying this out, I found, wow, these results are not as promising as I'd hoped they'd be. So I was trying to shoot the Orion constellation over Boston here, and the plan I thought looked pretty cool, and it came out okay in terms of my plan. This is sort of how I imagined it in terms of like where the constellation would be, that I could get it directly overhead this big skyscraper here. But then what I don't like about the image is it's just so distorted and the details are so soft. And I've found out since that with very narrow band filters and wide angle lenses, the way that the light bends and travels, it just doesn't work out very well because you just are bound to get this kind of distortion. But I have found that if you use a wider passband, so something like these new dual band narrowband filters that pass the emission lines at 12 nanometers or 20 nanometers, that you don't really run into this problem as much. So this is at 8 millimeters, which is very wide. But because I'm using a wider passband, it doesn't distort or soften the image as much as it did here at 5 nanometers. And then earlier I talked with this shot that I used a diffusion filter. This is something I've been experimenting with a lot recently, is using different kinds of diffusion filters with wide angle lenses to see their effect. And this is just a comparison showing you what it does. So on the left you have with no filter, and on the right you have with a soft-on diffusion filter, just to show you how much it will bloat the stars, but also really reveal the stars' colors. If you want to start playing around with a diffusion filter, but you don't want to actually go out and buy one for $100 or $150, I found someone on Instagram told me to try saran wrap or plastic wrap and just crumple it up so that you're getting all these little wrinkles in it, and then rubber band it on front of your lens, and it works pretty well. It really does work pretty well in terms of bloating the star halos, just like what I wanted with the diffusion filter. I did find that it softens other details more than a photographic diffusion filter, but if you were planning to just try this out and combine with other sub-exposures, I think this is a really cheap and easy solution. This is from my Bortle 8 driveway, so it's not the best image, but it's just to show how this technique can work. And one thing that I'm now often doing with diffusion filters is mixing sub-exposures with the diffusion filter on and with it off. And that's how I find you can sort of get the best of both worlds in terms of getting large, colorful star halos where you want them, and all of the sharp details that you can sometimes lose with the diffusion filter. So I find, if you do a mix of maybe 5 times no filter to 1 times diffusion filter, that's usually a good mix. Now you don't want to go too low with the integration with the diffusion filter, because you don't want to add noise to your image. But if you're really doing a big plan, like something like, let's say 10 hours no filter, then maybe 2 hours with the diffusion filter, it would be enough to add to the mix and get those nice colorful star halos. And I'll wrap up here by just saying a few things about processing wide angle camera lens kind of stuff. I find that what I often do is I'm taking lots of short sub-exposures, because I'm often using lenses that open up very wide. They're very bright lenses. So if you're shooting at something like f1.4 or f1.8, then you're going to get lots of very short sub-exposures. And the nice thing about that is then you can really, especially if you shoot over multiple nights, really pick and choose your best ones. And the best tool I have found for this is PixInsight's subframe selector, because that lets me see the focus, the full width at half maximum, the number of stars, which is a good indicator for if you had any clouds pass over, the eccentricity, which is a good measure of how round the stars are. So if you had any issues with the star tracker getting bumped or something like that, then those would show up that way. And I can reject a lot of my worst frames by playing around with these parameters. If you're a deep sky stacker user, they combine a lot of this stuff into one measure they call the score. And so, but it's the same basic idea. The PixInsight tool just gives you a little bit more granularity to reject frames. I like to crop my wide field exposures a little bit at the beginning, so you're not including any sort of registration artifacts around the edge. And then I also usually crop a little bit at the end, but that's more of a creative crop. So I really look at the image and decide how I want the features to look, how I want them to be lined up, and do another crop maybe at the end. Another thing I have found with wide field imaging is that the automatic background extractor in PixInsight is a very, very useful tool. I feel like it often gets a bad rap among astrophotographers who say, well, you should always just use the dynamic background extractor. But I think that that might be because they're using the default parameters with the automatic background extractor. And if you use the default ones on a wide field image, it's going to really overfit the model and look really bad. But if you relax the function degree, I usually relax it to 2, and then also use an appropriate size and spacing for your samples. I find that the ABE, the automatic background extractor, works very well on busy star fields like this, better than I can usually do with the dynamic tool. There's a lot of different ways to deal with a busy star field. There's now StarNet version 2, there's a Star Exterminator. And so these are both tools to remove all of the stars from your image, which I find is, for my workflow, is really helpful to be able to remove the stars so then you can bring them back in to your taste and de-emphasize them a bit that way. You can also try star reduction techniques. My personal experience with star reduction and wide field images has not been good. I think that when you have a very busy star field and with wide field images, it's almost impossible to reduce stars because they're so close together that you're bound to get these little wormy artifacts. And so I don't try to do star reduction anymore. I just remove all the stars and then play around with the curves, bring the stars back in. I use a screen blend in Photoshop, but if you're a PixInsight user, a screen blend is just invert both your stars layer, multiply it by an inverted starless layer, and then invert that whole thing. So there's a pretty easy expression to blend like this. And then I just make global adjustments to finish it off. And that's, I find that keeping the processing really simple like this gives me the best results, the results that I think stand up. So I'm pretty simple when it comes to processing. I just usually do a background extraction. I stretch. I find that the stretch makes a big deal. You know, how you stretch to preserve color or to preserve detail or different things like that. Using a starless technique and blending the stars back in, and then using lots of curves to taste to add contrast to saturation. All right. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, that was great. I think that probably half the audience now is going to go grab their 35mm. There was a question that Rowan had about what's your shutter count?
So when I sold my 5D Mark III, which was the DSLR I started astrophotography with, it had 180,000 shutter actuations. But I still was able to sell it with that many shutter actuations for $600, which I was amazed by. That people wanted it, even though it was well used. On my RA, I haven't checked yet, but I'd guess probably somewhere around 50 to 60,000 already.
Rory, did any other questions we missed?
No, that was the last one.
Anybody else have any comments? Again, Nico, it was a great presentation. I don't do wide field, but I feel like I should be doing it, and after watching you, I think I want to do it. In my Bordeaux, I don't know, can read a newspaper at midnight skies.
Oh, that's another thing I guess I didn't mention is I'm in Boston, but I have found that there's a lot of people say, oh, the East Coast is terrible for imaging, but even in Boston, if I drive an hour and a half to New Hampshire, I can get really pretty dark skies. So if you're in, I don't know where everyone lives, but in America, I find if you have a car, you can often get to dark skies relatively quickly and try some of these techniques out.
Yeah, and that one shot over the Charles from Cambridge to Boston, I recognize that location.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that is as bright as you could possibly get, and you got the reflection off the water, and you still got. Was that a composited shot, or was that basically all in one?
That was a composite because I had to use a slightly shorter exposure for the foreground. Yeah, but from the same location. I was at I was on top of the parking lot for the Museum of Science, if anyone knows the area. And that just gives you this really great view of the city and the Charles River there.
Well, I think we're all set for tonight. Don't forget, come back next week. Ron Bracher always has really instructive sessions. And no matter how much experience you have, there's always something to learn from Ron. And I think we're all set. Tim, it's with you. You want to take us out? And good night, everyone. We'll hopefully see you all next week.
I got one more quick question for Nico that rolled in.
Okay.
You ever tried using the Astrophotographer filter effect with wide field?
I wonder if you could clarify, because I wonder if he just means a diffusion filter, which is what I do, or if there's something else that I'm missing with the Kirafuji effect. What I've done, which I tried to describe in the presentation, is use a diffusion filter, these are photographic filters designed sort of for portraiture, for making skin tone look nice and smooth, but they work really well on the stars too. And so I don't know, I've heard mixed things about how Kirafuji did it, if he used filters or if he just used high altitude clouds to get the effect.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nico.
Sure.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.